All right. Why don't we go ahead and get things kicked off? Does that sound like a plan, Dan?
I think it's a great idea. Thanks, Zach.
All right, everyone. So thank you so much for making the time to join us here today. Dan Doyle, Zach Shefska. We'll be introducing ourselves here in just a moment. But before we do, just thank you for taking the time. We've got the hour session here. We'll try and get through our presentation relatively quickly so that we can address a lot of questions, do a lot of Q&A, make this as conversational as possible. And our objective here is to share with you what little bit of expertise or knowledge we have on our end to help you, start this new calendar year off right. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give Dan a little introduction, and then Dan, I mean, you can see my 2 lines there. Hopefully, you can make me sound pretty good. But Dan Doyle is the chief evangelist for fundraising report cards. So he's recently joined our team, but Dan's experience in our sector is far from recent. For a long time, I don't want to date you, Dan, but I think it was 10 or 11 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, something
Um,
like that.
yeah, 10 or 11 years. You were the CEO and principal at works with all of us recognize offices here in the Washington, D.C. area and out there on the West Coast as well. Before that, you had your prior experience in the nonprofit world, which I know we'll be talking about today from your time at Alzheimer's Association and others. But you have this illustrious career, and for some reason or another, you've taken a great enough interest in what we're doing with Fundraising Report Card, and you wanted to join us on our quest to help kind of democratize analytics and make it more accessible. So thank you.
You bet. Awesome. The other half of our team is Zach. Zach is out there right outside of Washington, D.C., where our offices are headquartered. He's the COO of Market Smart. That's the smart people, the team behind Fundraising Report Card. He had a bunch of engineers there join him and built the thing from the ground up back in 2016-17. I'd say you only wrote 2 lines here, but I'm going to add a couple more. One is that Zach serves somewhat as our analytic guru. He does almost all of the podcasts, Metrics That Matter, and is the author of a lot of blogs and articles that you'll find on our website. Any of the help information and resources that we have, Zach over the last several years has built all that. So there's a tremendous amount of information out there to help folks. So I encourage you to visit our website and see what else we can do.
Yeah, all sorts of good materials. I mean, I think they're good, and for the most part, we get positive responses. So useful information out there, and a lot of which we'll be referring to here today. But speaking of today, Dan, you kind of want to set the stage here for what we're up to?
Yeah, so today this is sort of a do-it-yourself, a DIY session on how to do a fundraising audit. So we're going to walk through what we call the six simple steps to a fundraising audit, and that'll be the bulk of our time. Then hopefully, if we've done our job well, there's lots of time at the end for questions and answers. So we'll field all of those. We are chock full of additional resources. There's some that you'll find along the way. And at the end of this session, you'll actually get a copy of the presentation. So don't worry about writing all the URL links and the website links. You'll have additional resources along the way. But at the end, we also have a couple additional resources we think you'd find helpful. And then finally, we have some analytic swag, as it were, some things that from a discount code to reminders about a free ebook that we have and our podcasts and stuff like that. So it's not quite the Oscars swag, I understand, but it's what we can do here on the analytic forefront.
Did we market this as Oscars level swag? Because I told everyone.
No,
okay,
we
good.
didn't.
Good,
No,
just
we
making
didn't.
sure.
No expectations. All right. So let's outline now real quickly what the 6 simple steps are, so that you can kind of at least get your mind around where we're headed here. So the most important thing to creating a audit of your fundraising program is to start with metrics. We are going to talk about 5 metrics that we think are helpful, but you might have some of your own, and I'll talk a little bit about that also. But you have to start with something. You've got to measure something. So metrics are the most important. The second step is do some benchmarking. Once you've sort of assessed yourself and what you're doing, you want to benchmark outside of the organization to understand how you compare to other similar like organizations or organizations that you admire and aspire to. Then step 3, you're going to want to reflect on what you did and didn't work. So what happened really well this past year, this past calendar year, fundraising year for you, and what didn't work. We're going to encourage you to sort of focus your energies on about 3 of those. Don't get overwhelmed. Then you're going to ask yourself, how can we do more of what worked? So how can we amplify or leverage all those things that we did really well across our fundraising program?
And it's important, I think, Dan, just to mention at this juncture,
Yeah,
this is the outcome of the audit, right? Like the first
yeah,
step is we're going to start with the 5 most important metrics, which, like you mentioned, are not necessarily set in stone, which I know you're going to get into the weeds of in a minute, but that's the foundation of the audit. Then
you
doing the
bet.
benchmarking is another component of the audit. And then the reflection is okay, now that I have this information in front of me, what didn't work? Well, now at step 4, we're finally at, okay, we've done all this due diligence. Now, how do I amplify what's gone well? This is like the evolution of an audit. An audit is not just a giant PDF that you have and sits there. Some people might call that an audit, but an audit is really something that you build off of and have thoughtful discussion around, right?
And is revisited year after year, and every quarter, every month, you go back to your audit to see how you're working against it. Very good point. I suppose along the way, you're going to find some things that didn't work in your organization unless you're perfect. If you are, I could give you plenty in my history of things that did not go well and that need to be fixed, but don't get too down on that. But you're going to have to work on some things that need to be fixed. And then you're going to set your strategies to move forward, to improve your metrics, to do more of what worked, and to try and fix those things that didn't work. So those are the 6 simple steps for an audit.
And let's make point of audit does not equal 100 pages of the PDF. Audit does not equal your full-time job for a month. This does not have to be as intimidating or overwhelming as the word audit. It kind of carries that weight of something that's going to really bog down your time. We're going to try and simplify that here.
Great point. Great point. And if you feel uncomfortable with audit, just call it an assessment or a worksheet. It really doesn't matter. But this is not paying an agency or a fundraising firm or anything like that $10,000 or more for them to audit. This is your do-it-yourself. What can you do internally with the own resources that you have at your fingertips?
And then one thing, Dan, that we're going to touch on more as we get moving forward here is considering who the audience of the audit is, because
Yes.
that's also going to determine this outcome. If we're going to have a presentation to the board, okay, the audit's going to look, or the assessment's going to look really pretty. If it's going to be something that's used internally with our team that we're just trying to spark a discussion, then it's going to be something that might be a little more rudimentary. We're going to hit on all these points kind of as we move throughout the presentation here.
Good point. Okay, so before we get into what we think are great metrics, let's talk a bit about metrics, because the first thing to know is one size does not fit all. We'll give you our 5 suggested. We think they're actually really quite good, and you might want to swap some out, or you might want to add a 6th or the 7th. But just know that any given metric for any given organization may not be the right one for another organization. If you're growing your program dramatically, you want to focus on acquisition and retention. If you're trying to optimize your program, you'll be looking at upgrade more than and downgrades more than anything else. So please don't take what we share as the 5 we recommend as being set in stone, that there is no one size fits all. A lot of it depends upon your program priorities, as I mentioned: growth, efficiency, upgrading. So give that a lot of thought and select those that are most meaningful to you at where you are in your life stage as an organization and what you are looking to do. Make sure the metrics line up with your priorities as an organization. Here's a couple resources that we think you might want to look at. As I mentioned along the way, we're going to throw a lot of resources at you. Do know that you'll get a copy of this so you can go through, but CauseVox, Network for Good, and Donor Search all have sort of fundraising metrics from beginners to nonprofit fundraising metrics. If you're curious beyond the 5 that we're going to share with you, what others are thinking, this could be a great area to look.
And one of the fun things is Article A and Article C up there I contributed to. So if not outright wrote.
Oh, really?
So
I didn't know that.
You're going to get...
That was not a gratuitous plug. I did not know that.
So you're going to get some good information there. The big takeaway from this is, where is your organization? What is the life cycle of your organization? Rapid growth, ongoing contraction, big push towards major gifts, things like that. That is the consideration here, because as we jump ahead to what we think are the 5 most important metrics, which I'll walk through here, these don't work for everyone. This first one that you're looking at on the screen, overall growth in donors and dollars in donors. Okay, every organization, for-profit, nonprofit, governmental, whatever it is, should be looking at, how are our total dollars, total revenues trending year over year, and how are our total number of donors, or for the for-profit example, customers, clients. That one across the board is an important metric that needs to make it into your annual assessment. But when we start to talk about things like donor lifetime value, and I know, Dan, we're going to dive in depth on donor lifetime value, but that's a really important metric when you're considering, your retention, your upgrade. So maybe if you're an organization that's really thinking about how do I make the most out of my major donors, we want to make sure that their lifetime value is going up. However, Dan, maybe you can speak to here, what about organizations that are rapidly growing? You want to be looking at these metrics, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we've got a good slide later on that'll talk a little bit about why acquired and lapsed are really important factors to be looking at, irregardless of where you are as an organization.
And that ties in with average donation amounts as well. Average donation amounts are another one where, regardless of where your organization is, this is something that you can look at. However, if there's a focus, if there's some sort of driver where we want to, I'll use the major gifts example again, that can skew our average donation amount, but that might be a good metric for us to be looking at annually, well, because that's the focus of our program. And then, of course, there's retention rates, which, again, as we talk about focus, this one kind of also it should be ubiquitous no matter where the organization is. And that's why it makes it onto our list here of the 5 most important. Year over year, this is a measurement of how well are we building relationships with our donors, with our funders. And that's critically important kind of across the board, but can take on more meaning in certain circumstances. And I just want to pause here just for a moment. Annette, thank you for your question. I saw it's come through the QA. Dan, I know we didn't discuss this, but I think if we do get questions that come through our presentation, we should take them. So Annette here says, what are your thoughts on average donation amount versus median donation amount? So I'll just set the stage here. Average donation amount is your mean. So you add everything up and you divide it by the total number of donations that were made. Median donation amount would be you line everything up and you look for what's the middle amount. My 2 cents, Annette, on this topic is that either works. And unless you're working in a incredibly complex database of millions of records and things like that, you're going to get a good answer, whether you're looking at the mean or the median for this particular metric. Dan, do you think there's any big distinction you've noticed in your career?
Nope, I agree. The only caveat I'd have there is average donation amount is sort of an industry standard. So I think if you're ever going to do benchmarking, that's the place that people are going to be trending to. They're looking at average donations, generally not median donation amounts. So that would be the only thing I'd add to that.
And I hate to even take it to this level, but we're all real people here with real lives. Not everyone knows the difference between mean, median, and mode. And I hate to say it because we're on a fundraising audits webinar, but not everyone knows that. So the reason I bring that up is if you're going into a board presentation, stick with the one that most people think they know, which is an average, which is the mean. But if you start throwing around median, or especially if you start throwing around mode, you could end up with some people feeling a little questioning themselves, like, oh, I don't really remember what mode is. But if you use average or mean, for the most part, you'll be playing it safe.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, and again, to our point, there might be other metrics. You have to think about your program. You have to think about what those initiatives have been year over year. But these 5, if you're starting from scratch or if you're brand new to your organization, this is a good place to start.
We'll go real quick here. I'll do the next 2 slides. Why only look at 5 years? So you got 5 metrics that we talked about. We suggest that you look at 5 years. On the left here, you're seeing donations for an organization from 1978 to 2017. And it's quite pretty, of course, and it shows lots of growth and all that, and it's something to be inspired by. But the problem is it's sort of data overload. And so what we always suggest, and what I've always found to be the most meaningful, is to look about 5 years back, because that's going to be the most recent information, which is going to be the most impactful to your organization. And you can actually sort of see micro trends that you can actually deal with. So what you can see on the right-hand side, same organization, but pared down to 5 years, is you can actually see the little trends going from 2013 to 14 and 15, 16, 17. You can kind of see the growth there a little bit better. You can understand what's happening. everything before that is a bit of noise in an audit. And I think that oftentimes I've found that it just sort of sets yourself up for failure, especially if you're reporting out to a board, when you include lots and lots of information, especially if you're an organization that's mature and not growing. They'll remember the old heydays where money was just rolling in the door. Well, those days aren't here anymore. So why do we look at that? Or they might look at the days in which things were lean. I think it's really important that you just focus on the most recent trends in your program, because it's most meaningful than the distant performance.
And Dan, I just want to throw in there for everyone that's
Yeah.
joining us, look at the axes. So I'm going to use my mouse here so we can all see. Your y-axis here is the same as it is over here. Essentially what we're talking about is when you manipulate your x-axis, you can drastically change the picture.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind, because you're going to run into instances where people also manipulate this y-axis. If you see here, it's starting at 0. And over here, it's starting at 0. You could take these two same reports, and instead of having it start at 0, you could have it start at 500,000 or 1 million. And it's also going to skew what you're looking at. So when you're doing an audit, you want to make sure that all of the reporting you're doing, so we're saying it's 5 years, but we also want to make sure that we are keeping a focus that our axes stay the same, or else we're really going to confuse not only ourselves, but our audience. And Dan, I see that another question that's come in here from Elizabeth, which again, we'll answer live because we're good on the fly here. Elizabeth says, I noticed most of the donations for this org are in the gold $5,000 and above segment. In my research, this is where a healthy organization should be. Do you agree with this? I am going to actually just jump in here. Elizabeth, we're going to be talking about benchmarking in a little bit. And when we do, we can talk about how some other organizations align with what you're seeing here on the screen. Little sneak peek is, yes, for the most part, there's a pretty standard distribution that we see of dollars from high dollar donors versus other segments, but we will touch on that in more depth coming up.
And it depends on the organization too. I remember Malwork was my partner at Malwork Donor Digital, and questions like that, his answer almost always would be, it depends. So there was always some sort of backstory to it. Well, if it's a large program with lots of little donors that they're moving up to be larger donors, it might look a little different, but I wouldn't mind this program. I wouldn't mind running this program on our screen right now. It looks really quite good. Okay, I'll finish this one up and then we'll move on to Zach. So overall growth in donors and dollars, this is a key metric for you. We talked about it sort of as the lead metric for what you're going to be measuring. And the important distinction here is to measure both donors and dollars over the year, because they can tell, just as you see here with the same organization that we're going to kind of go through the entire presentation, they can tell completely different stories for where you are and what your opportunities and challenges are. So on the left-hand side, you see what we've pulled up is the metrics for an organization, and we're looking at donors every year. And you can see they've actually had a decrease in donors year after year after year. So they have gone down considerably in the number of donors. Hopefully, and I think it was, that was a strategic plan on their part, because on the right-hand side, you can see the donations have actually gone up for the most part. 2013 and 14 were a little blip there, but what they've done is they've actually tried to grow the top of their file. So although they have fewer donors, they're making more donations. So kind of it's a bit of a seesaw, and you want to be kind of equal on both of these. You need to look at both donors and dollars, and don't miss the opportunity to understand what each of those is going to tell as a story to your program and its life stage and where you're taking it. So sort of this first most important metric for you to look at is growth in donors and dollars. That's sort of key. We listed on our 5, and you may have more or fewer, but if you're not measuring donors and dollars, there's a problem. So this has to be the first and foremost.
And Dan, isn't this dead simple? And I don't mean that in like a belittling way to us or anyone. Just it's going down or it's going up. We haven't even presented percentages or amounts or anything like that. You show this to a board member, you show this to your staff, you show this to your team. You have a sense. I mean, a little bit of narrative like you just did right there, but you have a sense for what's going on. And that's the beauty of taking a very simple approach to an audit. Is this is not, super complex, at least yet. We haven't gotten.
And this is something you could share outside to your board. This is information, depending on how good it looks, you could share to your board or your boss, or it's something you could just use yourself and internally with your team. You can quickly say, look, we're on track. We are down in donors, but we're up in revenue, which is exactly what we wanted to be doing. Or This is quite by happenstance that we arrived here, but yeah.
So then the second metric that made our five that we should be looking at would be donor lifetime value. So donor lifetime value is this measurement. It's really a projection of future revenues from a segment or a cohort of your database. So we ultimately come to donor lifetime value by looking at a couple underlying metrics like average donation amount, donor retention rate, frequency of giving, things like that. But your donor lifetime value is really going to be telling you how much we can afford to spend to bring in new donors, because this is what they represent in value over the lifetime of their giving. So if your organization is making a very thoughtful effort towards a particular cohort or subset of donors, like again, I'll use the major donor example, then you want to be seeing that in this case, the yellow line, the gold line, would also be increasing year over year, because the lifetime value of those major donors is going up. So looking at your donor lifetime value year over year, especially in that major donor segment, or another example might be if you have a new acquisition channel that you've pursued. So maybe you're doing some digital acquisition this year through Facebook or Twitter or whatever it may be. You want to look at, well, what did we spend in that area, and what was the value of that relationship that we brought in? And looking at donor lifetime value can help you. Now, this is much more complex than looking at total dollars, total donors, but it gives you kind of a little bit more of a peek under the hood into some of the things that are working and things that aren't working in a way that just looking at kind of the top line numbers can't. So donor lifetime value is a big one that we'll be referencing frequently from now and into into the future. And we have a cheat sheet. There's an easily accessible cheat sheet that you'll be getting the slides of this presentation. You can click on that little green link, and it's an overview of how you can capture, and there's all sorts of different ways to calculate lifetime value. So all sorts of information there that'll be included on that cheat sheet that you'll be able to get your hands on.
I'd add one thing here, Zach, and that oftentimes people are so focused on what's the cost to acquire a new donor. I was always very less interested in that than what is the lifetime value of that acquired donor. If I acquired a donor at $30 and their lifetime value was $50, that's one thing. If I acquired a donor at $100 to acquire and their lifetime value was $5,000, I'd rather go for that donor. So the cost to acquire is less important for me, frankly, and I think for our industry and folks in fundraising, than what is the lifetime value, and making sure that the lifetime value, the anticipated value, replaces the initial investment and actually expands the pie.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Okay, we're moving into acquired and lapsed. There's probably no reason why you wouldn't want to measure the number of acquired donors and lapsed donors, and they're a bit of they're side by side here because they kind of go hand in hand. This is the same organization we've been talking about, but new donors acquired is an essential metric for any audit, and frankly for any organization. Most organizations are aspiring to grow their programs, and so they're looking to have more donors in the pipeline to move up. And so you've got to measure that. You can see this organization has a slight decrease, but that's probably strategic in plan, and that they were focusing on other things. On the right-hand side, you're going to see lapsed donors. And this is donors, not dollars. You can see it's fairly static over the years. They haven't really found the number of donors lapsing on their file to be increasing. Now, if I was looking at this as a fundraiser, I would be a little concerned because we're acquiring fewer and fewer donors every year. You would think your lapse rates would be decreasing because oftentimes newest donors to a program are the ones that are most likely to lapse out of the program. So although you're seeing, oh, lapse is about the same, there's another half to this story, which is, are we acquiring a lot of people that are most likely to be lapsed? Actually, we're acquiring fewer of them. So there's this conversation, and good analysis and good audits actually lead to more questions about your programs. And so what I would suggest is you look at the opportunity for the lapsed people to reactivate and the new acquired donors against their lifetime value.
Awesome. So then there's this resource that we recently created. I think I'm going to take credit, Dan.
Please.
If you do have, when you're doing your audit, if you look and you see that there are a lot of lapsed donors, or that you think, even if it's gut feel that there's a lot of lapsed donors, fundraisingreportcard.com/retain donors. This was a very recent article that I put up, prompted by a really thoughtful LinkedIn conversation. Take a peek. I mean, it's not a one-stop shop type of answer, but it's some thought-provoking conversation around how do we actually retain those lapsed donors. Then we move in here to another one of our key metrics that we should be looking at on the annual audit, which is going to be that average donation amount. So this is, I don't want to necessarily say like simpler to grasp than lifetime value, because I think in a lot of instances, lifetime value is kind of like permeating our sector, and everyone, for the most part, is starting to understand that that's this ongoing measurement of value derived from our relationship. But average donation amount is this kind of like standalone metric that everyone knows, and across any sector, any industry, we're looking at the average account size, the average donation amount, the average transaction, whatever it may be. So looking at this year over year, and especially breaking this down by giving level or giving cohort, or if you have like donor clubs or things like that, that's going to be a really smart way to analyze year over year if we've been moving things in the right direction. And obviously then if things are going down, asking why, and if things are going up, asking the same question, why? What have we done that have increased the average donation amount? One caveat here with average donation amount, that and the big distinction between that and something like donor lifetime value, is average donation amount can go down in good instances. For example, if you institute a monthly giving program, well, your average donation amount might plummet because everyone's giving $10 a month instead of $100 annually. But the donor lifetime value will increase because, well, the frequency of giving is increasing and retention rate is increasing. So average donation amount is this kind of like stalwart, and we should still be looking at it, but it's potentially, depending on your circumstance, depending on your audience, a little bit inferior to lifetime value. You think I'm going down the wrong path here, Dan, or would you agree?
No, I think you're spot on, and I think you're spot on, and I think one of the things that you see here and what's being presented that I think is important for an audit is try and shy away from the overall average donation amount. So as you see on the left-hand side, it's almost $5,000 for this organization. But with average donation amounts, that can be skewed really quickly if you have a large bequest or you have a large, foundation gift of 6 figures and you have a smaller program. That's why we are really strong believers in looking at your average donation amount by whatever giving levels are appropriate to your organization. If you have under $100 and your average newly acquired donor is giving you $35, and then all of a sudden next year you start rolling out with a price point of $25, you're probably going to see a decline. But you don't want that to skew your view of the others. And so really breaking it out, I think, is incredibly helpful.
For sure.
Retention rates. Yes, you should retain your donors, and retention is the new acquisition, they say. But I think this is your slide here, Zach.
So retention is, like I said before, this measure of how well are we building relationships with our donors. And when it comes to donor retention rate, it's relatively straightforward. For this particular organization, if we look at their 2018, we can see that they retained, it's a little small, but it says 52% of their donors. That means that if they had 100 donors in 2017, 52 of them came back the next year. Okay, great. We want to be keeping track of that year over year. And just like we were talking about a moment ago with our giving level segments or giving level cohorts, we want to look at that rate of how well we're retaining and building relationships across those giving levels. When it comes to donation retention rate, this is a slightly trickier metric to comprehend. It's not as straightforward because we see here that in this case, in 2018, for this particular organization, their donation retention rate is 84%. And we can actually see it was 100% across these two little segments here. What does that mean? Well, that means of $100 that were donated in 2017, 84 of them came back again next year. And you might be scratching your head, how can that happen? This is a tried and true way to show upgrading behavior. So measuring both your donor retention rate and your donation retention rate. So the people, our supporters that renew year over year, and their dollars that renew year over year is this great way to show if your programs and your different activities that you're doing are paying off dividends or if they're kind of negatively impacting what you're doing. Getting a baseline for these two metrics, hugely important because it gives you the foundation that you can measure against and build off of moving forward.
So what we've just covered now are the 5 sort of what we thought of as the 5 essential metrics for a fundraising audit. And audit always starts with measurements, right? So you've always got to measure things, and you may have 5 different ones, you may have 10 instead of 5. My philosophy is keep it fairly simple, keep it consistent year over year so that everyone is on the same page. And hopefully you've seen here that, in our view at least, growth year over year, lifetime value, acquired and lapsed donor metrics, average donation amounts, and then finally retention rates are the 5 keys that we would put out to you as the starting point for your audit. That armed with this information, you're going to be able to see a lot of things in your program. You're going to be able to ask some really important questions of your program, have great observations about your program. Once you've done all that, you've in essence done sort of internal benchmarking, and now we'll walk over to the next slide and talk a little bit about other sources of benchmarking for your program. So here's a couple things that we think, if you can benchmark everything, that would be great. It's probably unlikely you'll be able to benchmark every metric that you have. So I would focus on, maybe 3 or 4 the most. Growth year over year. There's lots of resources out there where you can find, in general, how nonprofit organizations are growing year over year. You can find out how specific sectors are growing year over year. You can find it by channel, direct mail, or online. That's really important. If you are not growing and everyone else is, that's a real red flag, and it should come out in your audit. Similarly, if you are, or contrary to that, if you are growing exponentially year over year and others aren't, then that's going to come out and should shine in your audit. Retention rates by loyalty is very important, and that's a metric universally shared within the fundraising industry. So you'll be able to find retention rates, and if you can't find it for your specific sector or the specific size or regional nature of your group, that's okay. You can use larger sort of metrics nationwide. And then finally, we talked about average donation amounts earlier. That is a very widely benchmarked piece of information. It's not as widely benchmarked at giving levels, like what's the average gift below 100, but you should really look for average gift amounts to see if your file is trending. And to the point earlier, all of that gold that we saw, $5,000 plus levels, is that what you're seeing with organizations similar to you? So these would be at least the 3 I think you could have ready access to, and that you should be benchmarking against others. Here are a couple places that I think you can find those. So again, like I said in the beginning, you're going to get this presentation, so you're going to get all these links, and you can go out there and search these out. And I suspect if you go in here, it'll be great if you visited all 3 of these places, because I think you're going to learn a lot about what others are doing in terms of what they're seeing in terms of growth year over year and all of their information. And it would be really inspiring to see how other organizations are performing. So we've got fundraising report card. We actually have in beta live benchmarks. It's free. You can just jump on there and look online. M&R Strategic Services is sort of the 30,000-pound gorilla in the online space. They do an amazing annual online benchmarking. They're sort of the go-to place for benchmarking online. And then Blackbaud has dozens of benchmarking that's available. This is just one that you could do. They take a little while to get their stuff out there. This is still the 2017, so it takes a little while to get 2018 out there. But we strongly encourage you to do some benchmarking. And as I mentioned, kind of going back to the beginning, you've already done some important benchmarking, which is the year over year over year benchmarking for your program. So you've done some internal benchmarking. You want to sort of then sync that up with some external benchmarking. And here's some great resources, because that'll be an important part of your audit.
And I just want to mention, as we go through this is the cadence of the audit presentation that you're preparing. We're looking and we're doing our analysis, and then we're giving some context for how we've performed year over year, that 5-year view. And then we're giving some even, deeper context for here's how we are relative to our peers. Now we have Nancy, who I think was joining us from Albany. Hi there, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Who asked the question here. So she says, I always also ask, who should organizations be benchmarking against? For instance, peer, who are you like? And aspirant, who do you want to be like? That's a great point. Yeah.
Both. Sometimes, it could be an informal benchmarking. When I owned my agency, we actually did informal benchmarking with other agencies. I just pick up the phone and say, hey, are you renewing your clients? And, what are you charging for your services? Similarly, when I was at a small nonprofit in Chicago, I was able to pick up the phone and call some very similar organizations to ours, so I could do informal benchmarking. They were all peers. But I think to your question and to the point, it's also important to benchmark against aspiration points. Who is the organization that you most aspire to and you'd like to see sort of you leaning toward? I think those are great things to measure. So you may have to do it informally. You may have to pick up the phone and call a couple people or email, but I think that's a great question and well taken.
And like Dan's been saying, we're looking at this, year over year, and that's the first place to start. Don't get caught up in benchmarking as thinking you do have to go to those peers. Benchmark against yourself. There are going to be years where you've done better and years when you've done worse, and that is the first place to look.
All right. So what did and didn't work? So you've done all this assessment. You've done your internal metrics. You've looked at yourself year over year. So you've kind of done a little benchmarking internally. You've gone out in the marketplace and either accessed those resources that we shared with you, or you've picked up the phone or you've talked to some colleagues. So now you got to figure out what did and didn't work. So a couple things so you don't get too lost in what didn't and didn't work, because that's going to be a central part of your audit is, keep in mind the priorities you established for the year. So make sure when you look at what did and didn't work, that you're focusing on those things that did and did not work that were priorities for you. Ancillary stuff that didn't work, that doesn't have a big impact on your organization, it's not really worth highlighting. Really focus on those things that you had impact on, that significantly impacted your organization also. I suggest you always involve others, involve your direct reports, people on the ground, involve your boss, certainly involve your boss, because they'll certainly, you always want to know what they think didn't work right and how you're going to address it. Seems like 80% of my job when I was in fundraising was figuring out what my boss felt success would be. And then I think outside individuals, it's always great. You don't have to be board members, but other individuals outside of your organization who have insight into your organization, who might be able to give some perspective, a new donor perhaps that could say, I love giving to you, but I'll just tell you, the new donor welcome was kind of rocky. I didn't quite feel a part of your organization. The communications was disjointed. So I think there's some anecdotal information that you might gather in addition to the solid metrics that we provide that could be helpful. And then focus on the top three. Focus on the top three. Moving along. Actually, we probably should be really sensitive to the time. Thanks, Zach.
I got your back, Dan.
Thank you. So a quick example here, I was the National Director of Marketing at the Alzheimer's Association and ran a huge program, and they asked me to come in when it was in complete disarray and was year over year, millions of dollars weren't coming in that they thought would come in. It was going in the wrong direction. And they had before I showed up, they had one of these high-powered accounting firms come in and do a huge audit. I would suggest to anyone, don't have an accounting firm do an audit of your program, because they're accountants and they're not fundraisers. And after this audit, we had literally over 100 recommendations, I think. I put nearly here, but the more I think about it, I think it was over 100 recommendations. And I was with my team, we were charging forward, and we were going to really deal with all of these things. And what I realized is my right hand at one point, a couple months into this, as we were overwhelmed by the 100 things we needed to capture, he said one thing to me that has stuck with me now 20 years later. He said, Dan, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And we sat back, and what we realized is we were just diluting the potential to actually improve things, because the audit had so many things. And so that really got us to focusing on the top 10 things that we could do, chunk them out. We had 100 different things to do. So we took 10 on, we took another 10 on. And actually what we found is we got through about 40 of them, and most of the others we realized were not at all important or kind of washed away. So really here the message is focus.
And then it kind of gets to figuring out what worked. So after you go through and you take a peek at, figuring out where we're going to focus our energy, we then need to identify what can we do that actually, will push us to the next level. So like we've been discussing, you're going to look at these metrics, you're going to look at how they relate relative to yourself, look at how they relate relative to your peers, and then what can we learn about those wins? What were those wins? When you got to Alzheimer's, Dan, and you saw the 100 recommendations, there had to have been at least a handful of things that were going well. So how can you leverage those? How can you jump on top of those and continue moving those forward? And when you're looking at things, think in particular here, think back to donor acquisition, donor lapsed, retention rates. Those three in particular, if you see them moving in a good direction, jump on all over that and continue pursuing that. What's going to make the biggest impact? Answering this question again aligns with the organization's objectives or program objectives. And I'll use a great example. If there's a big push for acquisition, or there was a big push for acquisition over the prior years, it might be wise to come in now and think, okay, what can make the biggest impact? Is it more acquisition, or is it actually increasing our first-time donor retention rate? Kind of coming at your problems or your situations from different angles to think about which key performance metrics will kind of move the needle. That should be part of the outcome here as you're discussing and thinking about what did and didn't work. Think about the 80-20. Some areas are going to have bigger impacts than others. If we think about the organization that we've looked at throughout this presentation, if someone came into their shop and they said, we need to focus all of our attention on upgrading $100 donors into $500 donors, we would all agree that that's not the 80-20 rule. Remember, all of their donation revenues were coming from their major donors. So investing in some ways to further engage with those major donors, build relationships with them, et cetera, that might be more of the 80-20. And then thinking about, the end result, the big objectives that the organization has in place for the fiscal or calendar year, and even beyond, the 3-year vision, the 5-year vision. How can we make sure that we are measuring items that, push us in that direction, and surfacing that through the audit should push you towards that. So an example here would be, like I was just talking about before, if this organization in 2016 had 25% first-time donor retention rate, so if they acquired 100 new donors in 2015, 25 of them came back in 2016. But then let's say they implemented a new donor welcome series, something I think you alluded to a moment ago, Dan, and they were able to move that retention rate up 5 basis points. I mean, that's huge. That's investing in an area that they would continue to invest in. If we can implement some tactics and meaningfully influence our key metrics, that's something worth investing in. So we've got the welcome series that was introduced. The first-time donor retention rate went up. We're going to continue to invest in that area of our fundraising program. That's the idea of an audit like this, is just to surface this information, identify what's worked, what hasn't, discuss it, and take a next step.
Do more of it. Okay, so not everything's going to work, and so you're going to have to fix some things. Now, I wish this was a full, robust slide of all the ideas to fix what didn't work, but it's kind of, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of things that couldn't work. So I always encourage people to, and at the end actually of the presentation, you'll have my email address, and if you actually have something that did not work particularly well in your organization, want to email me, I'd love to chat about it and be happy to offer my insight. I've been in the business for 30 years on the consulting side, so I've been around the block. And what I think I've always shared with people is when you find those things that didn't work, focus on 2 things. One, see them as opportunities, not challenges. So even though people are not retaining as much as possible, that's a great opportunity to re-engage people who once had a relationship with your organization, and then to say, well, what are those concrete strategies we can implement to address what we saw as a problem year over year? Then I also find that oftentimes people are very busy doing things. Everyone's got a to-do list. Very few people have a stop doing list. And there are probably good reasons. An outcome of your audit will be, what should we stop doing that's getting in the way of us implementing things that we know are working well that we can leverage? So here, see your challenges as opportunities when you're looking at things to fix, and try and develop a stop doing list as a part of your audit, things that you're going to jettison, things that didn't work that you're going to stop.
Then we move on to kind of setting the strategies for
I'm sorry, Zach. Someone just said stop doing lists is genius. It wasn't my idea, but boy, have I used it in my career. And when I owned my agency, I told everyone, where's your stop doing list? What are you going to stop doing so that you can do more of what you need to do? Right.
Yeah, I wish you had actually taught me that one a little bit sooner before last year when you came on board. I needed that a lot sooner than that. But then when we think about setting the stage, for moving forward, what strategies can we derive from our audit? You need to think back kind of like, what's the story that our data is trying to tell us? If you've read the Fundraising Report Card blog for a while now, or if you read the Metrics That Matter, or the Data Driven Fundraiser ebook, or listen to the Metrics That Matter podcast, you'll always hear me preach the same thing, which is that all this data is great, but it requires some narrative. Okay, so it's very important that we're able to look at these metrics and say, make some conclusions about what we think should happen next. So a couple resources, or one in particular here that I've linked, fundraisingreportcard.com/outcomes. How do we think about this audit in terms of, the next step and what outcomes we're trying to get to? Then we have to start to think about our opportunities in the coming year. So there's another resource here that I'll link you to from my previous writings. It's the data-driven fundraising goals. How do we actually take this audit and then say, okay, I want to influence X and end up, over here at Y. What am I going to measure? How am I going to know that I'm getting there? And which levers am I going to pull? That particular article is going to point you in that direction. And then how does your audit actually support moving in this, strategic success direction? All very ambiguous. So how do we actually leverage all this work that we've done to create this audit? And that comes back to a data-driven fundraising plan. So how can we take the due diligence that you did at the beginning of this to measure your 5 key metrics and actually come up with a data-driven plan to move them in the right direction? So we need to think about our narrative. So what have we done in the past and what do we want to be doing in the future? Then we need to look at our audit and use that as our leverage point for moving forward. The 3 links here are kind of, chronological. Look at outcomes first, look at the data-driven fundraising goals next, and then the data-driven fundraising plan after that.
Excellent.
Now, once we have that all in place, and yes, we do have to be cognizant of time, so I'll move quickly here. We need to share that with others. There's even a resource here talking about explicitly how do I convey this information to a board member, because in a lot of cases, those are people that you need to convey the key metrics to. And having done that dozens of times on behalf of either clients or in my own volunteer capacity, using some of my experience there to give you my best practices.
I think I would highlight that for folks. That is, there's always that board audience or your boss. And if you look at anything and all the links we're going to share dozens of links in this, that's a really important one, I think, for folks to look at.
Doing all this hard work and then not being able to, I don't want to say like show off, but show off, here's what I've done. Here's where we go next. Everyone's looked at data tables, especially if you're in like Razor's Edge, the old version of Razor's Edge. No one wants to look at that data table. No one wants to pull up a giant Excel spreadsheet. So doing all this work and then thinking about how you share that with others, visuals or the narrative component, it's huge. It takes it to the next level. Makes it applicable, useful.
Yeah. So as we're getting ready for questions and answers, you can use the dialog box on the bottom, or you can chat also. What we've shared with you are a bunch of metrics that you should be thinking about, because that is the foundation of an audit. You might add some of your own or take out some that we added, but I think those are great 5 to start with. So you've got all of that behind you. We've talked a little bit about benchmarking, giving you a whole bunch of resources for how you can benchmark outside your organization, since you've just done with all the metrics benchmarked internally. Thinking about what you've done that worked really well, what needs to be fixed, and then finally, how does that all roll up into strategies for the coming year? So all of the tactical things you might do in the coming year are aligned with strategies for the coming year. So we'd love to, got about 5-10 minutes here, Zach. Love to answer any questions that folks have. And at the very end of this slide, I have my email address, and anyone can follow up with me directly if they have questions or have insights into their program they'd like me to see.
And I'm thinking, Dan, I'm going to take the moment here. Everyone's aware. If you have a question, please bring it to the forefront. I'll move through the rest of the slides here in just a second. I want to throw out there that there's going to be a brief survey after you log off the webinar. If you can take a moment and just complete that, it's just going to ask you about the types of information and materials you'd like to see us produce later on this year and the future. So just wanted to mention that as well. And I am going to hit the next. We'll move into some more resources, but please, if a thought pops into your head, as you can tell by now, Dan and I love to talk, so we'd be happy to do our best to address your question. Okay, cool. So Desiree posed a question here in the chat, lifetime value. Can you talk a little more on how to measure this? So here's what I'm going to do, Desiree. I'm going to finish up through the additional resources, and then we're going to break some webinar rules. And then we're going to actually jump out of the presentation. I'll show you the example cheat sheet that I'm going to send out. So we'll get to that in a moment. And then Dan, we'll send this one over to you. Lee says, I did not understand what you meant retention rates by loyalty. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yeah. So sorry, that was probably a little ambiguous. So retention rates by where they are in their life stage. So if they're a new donor, look at new donor retention rates. If they're a repeat donor, look at their retention rates separate from new donors. The reason you want to break it down by renewed donors and new donors and those various categories is if you are acquiring a whole bunch of new donors one year, they retain very low. And so your retention rate overall, if you just look at overall retention rate, could plummet. But it's only a factor of the contribution of the newly acquired donors to that pool. So it's always great to kind of break that out into those loyalties. Gladly that we were able to get that answered for you. Thanks for the question.
And the other thing to keep in mind there is also the distinction between first-time donor, your newly acquired donor retention rate and repeat donor retention rate. You can start to build a really big case for support, especially when you look at the average donation amounts of a first-time donor versus a repeat donor. You can make this big case for support 9 out of 10 times that you really need to be focusing your attention on just getting a second gift. That if you really simplify it, it's just how do we get a second gift? Because once we do, we have a higher rate at which we're renewing our donors, and they tend to give more. So that's another thought there, why measuring by loyalty or by cohort is so important.
Okay. Rounding out here, we've got a bunch of additional resources for you. These are various organizations that have other fundraising audits. So we've talked about our ideas about fundraising audits. I think others out there have other great ideas about fundraising audits. And the more you can immerse yourself before you embark on this plan, whether it's a simple thing that you're going to use internally or something really important to share with your board, I always say go out to others and see what they're suggesting. So I know Neon CRM has a great piece of write-up on fundraising audits that Zach wrote. I know Bloomerang, I love some of the stuff they produce. They actually have a little checklist for fundraising audits. It's a very different sort of approach than we have. So I think it'd be well worth your while to go out there and take a look what they put out and suggest for fundraising audits is their checklist. Really great one sheet that they have there. And then also Study Fundraising Info has a fundraising audit area that you can go to on their site that I think is actually really pretty helpful too. So don't just take everything we've said for gospel. There are other really smart people out there that can help you out too.
The only gospel was the stop doing list. That was true.
Yeah, that apparently is the winning key of the day. Yes. And now here we are at Analytics Swag. So again, please don't be disappointed because it's not going to be like the Oscars, but we've got 3 things that we want to mention to you. And a fourth one popped in my head before as we were marching along. The first is we're going to be sending you a discount code if you want to buy a pro version of Fundraising Report Card that has all these metrics and all those reports that you saw, the visualizations we pushed out of there, and it was super easy to do. You can upload your file. So we'll send you a discount to that and you can compete. There's actually a free version. If you have less than 5,000 transactions in your organization that you want to look at, you can create a free version. You're up and running, no problem. We also have a free ebook on metrics that matter. I would strongly encourage you to download that and take a look at that. That's a great read. It's a short read, but it's a great read. And then we do an occasional podcast. You can sign up for the podcast there. And there's also a blog, and that's the one I forgot to mention. Zach blogs a lot. And so you'll find he has a lot of information he's sharing from time to time on our blog that you can actually find on our website, fundraisingreportcard.com.
Now I'm going to flash Dan's email up here because he really is a great resource. Quite frankly, even in my career where I am, I look to Dan as a mentor and as a resource. So please don't be bashful about communicating and getting in touch with him. D.Doyle at
email me.
Report Card.
I'm happy to, I've been in fundraising consulting for 30 years with organizations, small, regional, and large, and always happy, even though my role isn't a consultant here, it's helping people analyze information. I'm happy to talk with anyone about their programs and offer my observations.
And if you don't feel like emailing Dan, email me and I'll just give you a cell phone number. It's way easier that way.
You're
And I'm
right.
only
There you
kidding.
go. Call me. Call me.
Now, I just want to break out the slides for a moment here and show Desiree asked about how to actually measure donor lifetime value. So Desiree, I'm going to link everyone to after the fact. We'll send out the recording. We've got this nice cheat sheet, okay? And this cheat sheet's going to break down your actual equation, some of the things that can influence your donor acquisition cost and your lifetime value. So we'll send this link out and you'll have that resource. And now that I'm pulling this up and thinking, I think I've also written a blog post extensively about this as well. And it pairs up nicely with some components from the Data-Driven Fundraiser ebook. So there's, if we pair all this together, you're going to have a great answer to that donor lifetime value question. Okay, you said thank you. Cool. I've addressed it. You're making me feel better about that, Desiree.
Yay. Zach, I can't believe this. We somehow have managed to not go over our time, have a couple minutes left over. That's great. People can enjoy a longer lunch depending upon where you're at, or have a couple extra minutes to relax. You've been masterful in getting us through all these slides. I really appreciate that. Everyone, it's been wonderful having you online. Any parting words, Zach?
I just can't believe you said longer lunch. I'm here on the East Coast and I could go for dinner soon. So anyway, but that could be a webinar on a totally different topic of, do we really need time zones? We'll leave it. We do. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
We really appreciate your time.
Have a wonderful day, and don't worry about reaching out to me. Look forward to hearing from you all.
We'll follow up. There's a survey after the fact. Oh, I think I just saw a QA. Paul said thank you. There's a survey after the fact, and we'll get the slides out as soon as we can so that you can click on all those links. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.